What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 227. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. Another bonus show to round up the week, and we're talking about the raid to take out the ISIS leader. Biden is making a big deal out of this and really trying to draw a lot of comparisons, I think, to what Obama did with the Osama bin Laden raid. And so we'll be breaking down everything we know about this raid so far, what it could potentially mean for ISIS, what it means for Syria, and also the recent major prison outbreak in Syria by ISIS and how that may be tied into this raid. So a lot of interesting stuff on today's show, and I'm really happy to be joined by Matteo Marchionni on the show. He was last on in September to talk about the Netflix 9/11 documentary, and so ISIS is something that Matteo knows a lot about, and we have a nice conversation on. He has a lot of great insights and has really dug through essentially everything that's been reported on this so far and brings us up to date on what's happening. So I hope everybody enjoys this bonus episode. Be sure to share it and check out Matteo's work. You find the show at the Libertarian Institute on the blog at antiwar.com. We also post the show on YouTube, Rumble, Odysee, and always share it on our social media accounts at Twitter and Facebook. The Twitter handle is at @con_interest. You could donate at Patreon, Subscribestar, or Crypto. All that information is in the show notes page. And you could also support the show by doing your CBD shopping at Paloma Verde. PalomaVerdeCBD.com, promo code PEACE. When you use that and spend $75 or more, you get 25% off and the show gets a kickback. It's a great deal. It's a great company with high quality CBD products. So get yourself some Paloma Verde and enjoy this episode. All right, everybody, let's get into the show with Matteo. Hey, Matteo, welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. How you doing today?
Hi, Carl. Nice to be back. All good. How are you?
Doing very well, and excited to have you on today to break down the raid on the leader of ISIS that was just killed in Syria. Joe Biden made a big speech and almost looking like he's trying to create an Osama bin Laden assassination moment for himself and replicate his boss. And so I think it's really interesting and worth breaking down, talking about what we know so far and what could come of this and why it's so important. And so very happy to have you here to talk about today, Matteo. Before we get into the raid, there were a couple events in Syria over the past week that I did want to mention that I think are important and may have, more or less some relationship to what happened in the raid. The first is that Brett McGurk, who is the U.S. envoy to the Middle East, said something along the lines of the U.S. will never normalize relations with Syria's Bashar al-Assad and was discouraging other Arab states to do so. And this is just in line with the entire U.S. Assad must go policy that continues to linger on. We're now, 5 years past when everybody knew Assad was going to win the civil war, or probably more, honestly, maybe close to 7. This is 2022. And so the idea that the U.S. would, prevent other Arab states from starting to normalize relations with Syria is really problematic, and preventing Syria from being rebuilt is preventing aid from getting into that country. Right now, the suffering going on in Syria has amounted to babies freezing to death in camps in areas like Idlib, which is where this raid took place. And then maybe one of the most significant events in recent days, of course, is the massive ISIS prison attack on a Kurdish SDF, which is the U.S. proxy force in northeastern Syria, attack with 500 people ending up dead. Talked about on the show like midway through. It's lasted about 10 days, this attack. And by then, the U.S. was carrying out airstrikes. There was U.S. troops in the region, although it's unclear exactly what the U.S. troops did. They're saying at least 374 prisoners and 77 prison staff were killed. And then also people were killed in nearby areas after the fighting spilled out. And so, this is the ISIS group that carried out the attack. And I don't know, did the head of ISIS that Biden assassinated was still alive at the time. So does that have any role? Last thing I'll mention on the prison break is just there's a lot of missing kids. So apparently that ISIS prison was also flooded with children who were maybe children of ISIS fighters, maybe young ISIS conscripts or things like that. And there's hundreds of them in that prison, and now it's not exactly clear where they are, or how many of them were killed in the attack, although some were definitely killed. So Matteo, let's talk about the raid. Who was killed? What was he doing, and where was he at, and all that kind of stuff. Let's just get into all the details.
Yeah, for sure. So I found out about that something was going on the night as it was happening. I don't know, just casually, I was going to bed really late. And in Syria, it was like 1 a.m. And so this raid lasted from 1 a.m. to 3 a.m. So that was 2 hours. Um, and basically, I woke up in the morning, and it turns out after a few hours there was some confirmation that al-Qurayshi had been killed, which is the ISIS leader, has been head of them since the death of the predecessor al-Baghdadi in 2019, who was also killed by a US raid. Um, and at the beginning, there was also speculation that potentially the target had been Zawahiri, who is currently at the head of Al Qaeda Central. Um, just because of like it should have been a swift operation of taking up or one leader. But actually, then we found out that that was actually planned and it was supposed to last that long. But essentially, we're talking about the northwest of Syria in Idlib. This is an area which is controlled by HTS, which are basically is an insurgency basically by HTS, which is basically against the Assad regime. Although they don't control all the areas, there's a lot of Turkish influence there. In fact, this location where al-Qurayshi was hiding was like 15 minutes from the border of Turkey. I saw. I'm guessing that's probably by car or something. But really close to the Turkish border. And the US basically special forces came in. We don't know how many people from the special forces. We just know that they got there with helicopters. One of which they actually there was a malfunction with them, and they kind of flew it away from the site and was actually destroyed, just left there. At least this is what we've been told for the time being, because there is a lot of information. It's been what, a day and a half, and which means a lot of reliable information needs to be verified. There's a lot of translations that have to be made also of like witnesses who were there, who have made videos and statements in Arabic, of course. So we're waiting for those.
And
But
you haven't,
yeah,
just since we talked about the helicopter malfunction, they are saying it's a malfunction. Like, who know? Like, that could be a very clever way of saying that somebody shot at it, and a bullet caused some damage, causing a malfunction, and then but there's no reports of U.S. casualties or anything like that. And
right.
because we are kind of early on talking about this here, a lot of the narrative that we're getting is from the U.S. media. Not that we don't, haven't looked at some Arab sources and everything like that, Syrian sources, but this is this is largely, just what's being put out by the U.S. government.
Of course, yeah, exactly. As you said, there weren't any U.S. casualties, so that would suggest that it wasn't shot down, right? But we'll wait for more confirmation on that. So to get to the actual nitty-gritty of the situation, so the special forces got there, and al-Qurayshi was hiding in this building, which was three floors, and he was on the top floor. And I think the US basically they'd asked everybody with like microphones, megaphones, to get out of the building. On the bottom floor, there was other civilians who were just living there, probably not knowing that al-Qurayshi was on the top floor and who he was. But anyway, a number of people were evacuated from, I believe, the bottom floor. And then at the second floor, so the middle floor, there was al-Qurashi's lieutenant with his wife and kid. And at the top floor, you have al-Qurashi with his wife and I believe two kids. And so here the numbers also floating around are different. Depends, still waiting for a proper assessment. It's been surfed that there were 14 deaths in total. Some say 16. The US, I believe, has only confirmed like four. So there's still definitely like we have deaths of people who are definitely unconfirmed, and we don't know exactly how they happened. But the narrative goes that they arrived at the site. They asked people to get out, and not too long after, al-Qurashi basically, with an improvised explosive device, just blew himself up, and that killed himself, of course, everybody who was on the top floor. So his wife and children, and you can see that quite clearly. We saw the images of those really early on of like this building. You can see part of the ceiling from the top floor has collapsed, and all the kind of walls which have collapsed as well from the building down onto the floor seem to suggest that that was the case, like that the explosion would have come in from the inside, from how it kind of these things have fallen. But again, it's still hard to determine. Also because in a near site there was this other building, which is I'm sure you've seen it, Carl. It's this building with like white and blue stripes, and it's got all these holes in them. Collateral damage for sure, but it would suggest that some firing had been going on there, and who's to say that that wasn't the case? Maybe also with the building of Karachi himself. And then the middle, so going from top to bottom, the middle floor, we had the lieutenant and his wife, who were met by special forces, and they were exchanging quite heavy fire, from what it seems. Though I've not seen any pictures of kind of the site where there's any bullets, any remains of that, which is I find quite interesting, because surely there would have been. But anyway, in this face-off, the lieutenant and his wife were killed, and I think that the kid of them was also killed by special forces in the mix of it. And that's pretty much the main kind of story of the building. We also know a couple of people who were from outside of the building also came to the site, and were, I believe, down by special forces as well. And we don't really know who these people are. It's circled around that potentially they were actually HTS members who maybe didn't know what was going on. There was like confusion between the two sides, and so stuff happens in operations and war. So but again, we don't have confirmation of that either. I'd say that's pretty much all the news, at least what we've heard from the United States, because Paul Kirby yesterday, who's press secretary for the DoD, came out and kind of answered questions. And that's pretty much what we learned, the malfunction. I guess the other important thing to say is that Karachi, his body was left there. They managed to identify him, from what they said, from fingerprints on the site, and taken away some DNA. But yeah, he was left there, and I have seen a mugshot of him, of what was remained of him, which is interesting because it blew himself up, and there's like his face is pretty intact.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, so as I say, we'll have to wait and see as things come through.
Yeah, so a couple things. I guess just to clarify, you said there's like three levels on the house. So on the bottom level, the family there is unrelated to whatever else is going on in that building. They're just, and they came out of the house when the U.S. Blew on the megaphone, stuff like
Right,
that.
right. Yeah.
Okay. All right, and then yeah, I do agree. Like I saw the pictures they published of the people, or some of the people who are alleged to have died at the scene, including a very small body, definitely some kind of infant. From my understanding, that the claim is that when he blew himself up, he did kill what, two children and maybe one or two women, but the totals are the estimates are that I think 6 children and 2 to 4 women died in total. And I just want to bring this up because in Western media, I'm kind of seeing it as, he blew himself up and women and children died, which is true, but the way the numbers work out, it does suggest that women and children died from some other way than him blowing himself up. Right? That's be your understanding too.
Yeah, so on the third floor there was him, his two kids, and his wife, and they all supposedly died from him himself blowing himself up, and that's quite certain, I would say. But there's a number of people, so then that's four people if you count the lieutenant, the kid of his, and his wife. That's seven people, and then there's about another 10-ish people who are not accounted for, who we know are died. A couple of people including kids, were injured and taken to hospitals nearby as well, still undergoing treatment. But again, there are casualties which we're certain of, which we don't know how they died exactly. Yeah.
Yep. And then so you kind of mentioned it, this it looks like a detached garage, like if you lived at an apartment building, like they have the apartments and then they'll have like these garages and you could rent out one of the garages, and there's like three of them and there's three blue stripes on top, and it does look like there's a lot of shrapnel if not bullet holes in there. And I haven't, and I believe you haven't either, kind of been able to identify where exactly that is in relation to the house, correct?
Yeah, that's right. I unfortunately haven't had the time today. You could probably find that if you geolocate it on Google Maps. I wouldn't, it's probably, just surrounding there. But it's interesting to see. I've seen lots of people, talk about it. And like, it was actually one of the first pictures I saw yesterday morning. Um, but nobody actually answering, well, what actually went through this? Where exactly is it? And what has it got to do with the rest of the story? So.
And there is some video that was out. I think you said this, alleging to show like some fire in the it's not like of the actual thing, but if somebody was, I don't know, a couple hundred yards away and filming with a decent camera, you could like kind of see something looks like an exchange going on in the background. We do know that a U.S. helicopter malfunctioned according to them and then was destroyed, and you could see some pictures. It looks like it was pretty thoroughly destroyed. It was like half blown up. And so I guess how much like gunfire was there, and like how large was the battle? That you say they were on the ground for 3 hours, which would seem to suggest a lot of fighting, and there's some video that looks like that as well. But at the same time, the fact that there's apparently no U.S. casualties and as few of combatants seem to be among the dead as have been reported, and the damage to the house itself doesn't look like there was a large gun battle around it. So I don't know if you have anything on that. I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point, because actually, I think so. The fighting started quite early on, within the 2-hour span of the mission. But it's interesting, as I said earlier, there's no kind of from the pictures we have any, sign that any bullets were fired, like anything on the floor like that. And but at the same time, one of the first videos I saw, which was in the middle of the night as this was unfolding, was it's a video where you can't really tell much because it's nighttime. But you can hear basically US forces speaking because it's definitely English and American, and you can hear gunfires being shot. And so, yeah, in the official report, there's nothing about that, except for the firing with the lieutenant on the second floor. But I think there's still more to find out about that because I assume there was more than just that going on for 2 hours.
Yeah. So this is being described and touted in the U.S. as a assassin. I think maybe part of what happened here is a big propaganda narrative and things like that. But um, this is, I guess, really interesting, right? That you have this many civilian casualties. You had to blow up one of your own helicopters, and you're just, touting it like a giant victory. Not that not killing the ISIS commander could be insignificant completely. But I was wondering maybe if we could move on to like this part of it and talk about what does this actually mean? You know, you have the
Yeah.
Washington Post editorial board running an op-ed saying that, look, what this means is that after a successful raid, shows the war with ISIS is winnable, but not yet won. And this really cuts against kind of my interpretation and what I say. And you can't win an ideological battle and killing the leader of ISIS, who nobody's ever heard of. No, I don't mean that literally. Like, obviously, you knew that this guy's name and other people did before too, but largely it's not like al Baghdadi, Osama bin Laden, or Zawahiri, or somebody that somebody would, go, oh, yeah, that's definitely a terrorist. This is just what most, I think, Americans would describe as like a Muslim sounding name. And so, do you see any like what do you think maybe the significance of this is?
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think it's quite obvious that to anybody with a bit of sense that, as you say, it's an ideological war and you can't just defeat it by with bullets, you know? Um, and I think that's one actually of the main faults of the whole counterterrorism strategy of the United States since its inception. But anyway, he yeah, it's actually interesting that he we never really saw much of him. Like as much as you follow the situation, al-Qurayshi had been pretty good at like hiding, I would say, just because we never really heard much about him. Um, we never really got any photos. I think the pictures we got yesterday of his body after his death is probably like the third or fourth picture we actually have of him. The main one being the one that was in Wikipedia, which I think was taken from him in Camp Buka years and years ago.
Well,
But
that's important too, and something that maybe we should take just a second to mention is that this is a another graduate of the U.S. Iraqi torture camps that they were running, just like Al Baghdadi, and that's probably pretty important to what he was doing and why he was doing it.
yeah, I mean, don't quote me completely, but I'm pretty sure it was Camp Buka. But yeah, and so he remained quite low, but at the same time, it was from what we know, he was running a lot of the ISIS central operations anyway. Like he still had a very important role. Although ISIS, since the death of al-Baghdadi, has changed a bit, its operations are more decentralized. And although he was like the head of it and running, still had a very important role in those. It's decentralized in the way that the death of, say, for example, him doesn't mean that it's not the biggest hit to the organization. And they'll probably announce someone else to lead the organization in the next coming days or maybe weeks, as they did last time. And they're prepared for stuff like this. It's like after experience in all these years, they have an organizational structure that kind of enables them to kind of bounce back and from situations like this where things go wrong, and especially when the leader is killed. It's something they definitely are prepared for.
Yeah. Well, that kind of goes to being an ideological war too, right? Where they're willing to die for the cause, by evidence of the past two leaders of ISIS blowing themselves up at the end of their lives, right? Like,
Sure.
they're not just trying to cling to power and do anything they can. These people are ideological. They're really committed to trying to fight the jihad or restore the caliphate or anything like that. And so yeah, these are organizations set up to replace the dead leaders. That's I don't think a surprise to anyone. And I mean, look, this is not, I don't want to just say like it's nothing, but how many leaders of the Taliban or AQAP or Al Shabaab or any other of these, various jihadist groups around, the Middle East and North Africa has the U.S. claimed to killed over the years? And from everything I could tell, that it just keeps spreading. You can't kill your way out of it. And then you also have this idea. Biden called a cowardly last act. I think Trump did too, talking about like Bad Daddy and this guy blowing themselves up, killing the kids and everything like that. And yeah, I mean that's true, but at the same time, I don't think that it necessarily undoes the fact that the U.S. carried out a violent operation, went in there with guns, and kids ended up dead. And and I'm sure that as much as we're kind of unsure about the narrative, that people particularly in the Middle East are going to be very skeptical of that and may feel that that this guy didn't blow himself. The US just went in there and executed everybody, then set off an explosion to cover up the murder or something. Like, I'm not saying that's
Yeah.
what happened, but I'm saying that if people in Idlib, Syria all believe that after this happened, and that was actually a rallying cry and a recruitment tool for ISIS and al-Nusra and these other jihadist groups that exist in northern
Right.
Syria, I would absolutely expect that to be the case.
Right, right. Actually, yeah, yeah. I guess also the fact that um the narrative that he blew himself up does make sense. Like he would 100% prefer killing himself and his family than being killed by the US, or even obviously even worse, being captured, right? It would it's definitely a better outcome. And so in that sense, it does make sense that he would have done that. And he would have been prepared. I'm sure I saw even pictures of like other explosives on the site which didn't explode, or which, there was extra stuff, which is interesting to me why the US might have not taken away with them. But anyway, yeah, I do overall think it is like structurally it's not a huge blow, but I think because it is an ideological war, as we said, it's more of a moral blow, right? Even the prison attack there was in many ways successful, and I would say a big boost to the morale of kind of the group. This definitely would counter that, right? And I think a lot of it has to do with that. It's the spread of ideas and how much people believe in the cause, and that helps with propaganda, recruiting, and just essentially at the end of the day, making the group stronger. Though you have to admit that the group isn't as strong as it was, as its height in 2014. At the time they had the caliphate, they were running a state between Iraq and Syria, and so there's definitely been, successes in counterterrorism from that point of view. But it's a very fluid environment, and it keeps changing. Even lots of the Islamic State over the years, especially since the death of Baghdadi, has expanded to the Sahel, North Africa, Central Africa. We see even the ISK from the Kandahar province in Afghanistan, and it's a much different group than what it used to be when before it was ISIS central, more centralized, and it had a more central authority. And whilst it still does, it's it's more independent in many ways. The various factions it has, yeah.
Yeah, it does. It seems to have resembled more an Al Qaeda style group since the fall of the caliphate and losing the physical territory, versus what Bad Daddy was trying to do. Like, literally created a pretty large state in the Middle East,
Yeah.
with ISIS at a time. So I mean, there's a lot of like little paths I want to go down still, but I want to take 1 second and stick on the narrative topic and talk about. There's a really good article by Jeff Shogel in Task and Purpose on this, titled "White House on Ukraine and Syria. If you don't trust us, then F you." And of course, he's mainly highlighting in this article the fairly viral video. I think it has like 5 million views on The Hill this morning, just on Twitter alone, of the U.S. State Department spokesperson Ned Price going back and I believe this was Price going back and forth, or it might have been Kirby, with AP reporter Matt Lee, no, this wasn't Ed Price, and Matt Lee go back and forth, and basically at the end, Ned Price says, "Take our word for it, or else." And then you also have this short interchange between Jen Psaki, who's the White House press secretary, and a NPR reporter on Air Force One. And Psaki said, skeptical of the U.S. military's assessment when they took out an ISIS terror and leader of ISIS, and then said something along the lines of that if you don't believe the U.S. narrative, then you're taking the ISIS narrative, and that's not obviously not what we're doing here. We're not like saying, oh, we're trying to promote the ISIS narrative or anything, but it's more than allowed to question what the U.S. government is doing, and so I think that's a very important point to add on the whole narrative is we had to really question what the U.S. government is saying, and I appreciate you going down and saying that it could be this, it could be that, because that's really what needs to be done here, and not just saying that, oh yeah, we know what happened.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're just trying to get to the bottom of things, and often we know that in conflict and war, there's most of the time not like a good guy, and everybody obviously kind of promotes their own viewpoint, and we know there's probably some truth in both, there's probably some lies in both, and so the objective really is always to try and get all the sources and get the best assessment that we can make with what we have available.
So another, I guess, question I had for you on this subject is, do you think that the ISIS prison break maybe pushed Biden's hand here? I mean, I guess it may be harder to calculate politically, right? Like if Biden was just like, boy, I really need a foreign policy win, Ukraine's a mess. Uh, I mean, I don't oppose the Afghan withdrawal, but hell, even Jen Rubin, who is the biggest Democratic sycophant in the U.S., says he really shouldn't have withdrawn from Afghanistan. So this raid was a massive win. But with the prison break and everything like that, maybe it was political, but I don't know. Do you maybe see like a tactical reason, or like, or the fact that maybe the U.S. thought this guy was incompetent, just letting him like kind of fester in some guy's attic, right? And then he comes and like pulls off an attack, and you decide, well, maybe we do have to take him. I don't know. What are your thoughts on the reason for it doing it now? Because my understanding in the reporting is that this was planned for months.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. I don't know how many months, but I believe um, Biden was given the opportunity to carry out this exact operation just before Christmas, in December anyway, before Christmas. And so he decided, I don't really know for what reason, but to postpone it. Yesterday, John Kirby, sorry, said that, we're waiting for the right circumstances in many ways because it's a very delicate operation situation. You have to have rehearsals. He mentioned even like the weather being the right thing, which for sure makes sense. But there's definitely some politics in there. It does play into it. Maybe before December wasn't the best time to do it for politically speaking. And I don't know. Now we have the third U.S. president in a row who's killed the head of one of the leading terrorist organizations, which they're facing. And and yeah, I guess it comes well after the again, as going back to the battle of ideas, after the prison break. In that sense, it makes sense. Maybe that's why it was carried out now. I initially thought, maybe they just found out about that he was sitting here hiding just recently, but it turns out they weren't, and they didn't. And so yeah, I would say it's probably a mix of circumstances and political reasons. Yeah.
Yeah. I guess I just add to that, there has been, I feel like, an increased ISIS activity in Iraq too recently. I know the Iraqi government recently carried out airstrikes and killed 9 ISIS fighters, or what they say were 9 ISIS fighters. Um, but that these ISIS prison camps in northeastern Syria have been a festering problem for, I mean, I'm 6, 7 years now. There, so think about this. Like, if you were a 3 or a 4 year old, in 20 what 14 2015, when your father, who was an ISIS fighter, was killed by the Americans or the SDF. The rest of your family is rounded up. You're now 10 and have spent the bulk of your life in one of these prison camps that are run by the SDF, but not really. The sexual abuse in these camps is rampant. The corruption, blackmailing for different kind of sanitary products or food, or all these things happen are major problems in these camps. So it's not necessarily surprising to me that something like this finally happened. But do you see any long-term plan on what to do with all these prison camps or refugee camps? I get because the Western governments are refusing to take any of them back. A lot of these kids are children of, you know, UK citizens, US citizens, French citizens, things like that, or like Turkish or Iraqi or things like that. Of course, whenever they sent them to Iraq just holds mass trials and executes like 14 women. You're all guilty for being married to an ISIS fighter. Now go die, and so there's no justice there. But nobody else wants anything to do with them either. And so it doesn't seem like it's a problem that necessarily it can be resolved by killing the head of ISIS. You have to like clear out the prisons.
Oh, well, yeah, sure, absolutely. It's a much more difficult battle than that. But personally, well, you have all these, as you say, all these ISIS fighters who, lots of which are have citizenships in Western countries and stuff like that, and they've been sitting there for all these years. Um, I mean, wherever you put these people, they're gonna most likely be a threat to security. And so at that point, is it going to be a threat to security in the Middle East, or is it going to be a threat to security in your own country if you bring them back? And that's not for me to decide. But if you leave all these people, and there's hundreds of them, as was the case in this instance, then the risk is really high that something like this would happen. And I think that was a huge mistake because it's something they should have been expecting really all the time, and it's baffling to me how it just happened really swiftly. I think it was an operation carried out over months as well. Like you'd had ISIS fighters from the outside who started living in the surrounding areas, and then a bit at a time, and then coordinated the attack. They didn't just show up as an army, right? But yeah, it's something they should have been prepared of. And I even heard of communications between people inside the prison, outside the prison, ISIS fighters. And so even from a security standpoint, there's stuff that should have, been improved, and it shouldn't have gone as it did, really. And from their perspective, probably was a success because I forget the number of how many actually went in for the raid. It started off with like improvised explosive devices. I think it's like one or two trucks or something like that. Um, and there's like hundreds and hundreds more who were liberated. So when you balance it out, is in that sense a success. There's a lot more people, a lot more ISIS fighters out there than there were a few weeks ago. Let's put it that way. And so yeah, I don't know. I just
Yeah,
don't.
because I was thinking that maybe that was one of the reasons to carry out the raid now, for a tactical reason. If you think that, maybe he now has a whole bunch of more soldiers to coordinate, or maybe is even in a unique position to coordinate with them. Because I'm sure that, they have a plan to all like maybe go into hiding and then come back out slowly after they make contact. They're not going to just go to like some building and all get together and wait for somebody to come give them orders, because the US will just drop an airstrike on it. So I'm sure they have like some kind of plan. So maybe this could mess with the coordination there. I did want to ask if you heard anything about coordination with either Turkey, Syria, or Russia on this, because it did happen in Idlib. So this isn't, US-held Syria, like where the prison was. This raid was in uh, Syria that's controlled by HTS, the Al Qaeda affiliate in Syria, or their Turkish backers. So
You mean for the what happened a couple of days ago
yeah,
with al-Qurayshi? Yeah.
yeah.
Um, Well, the Kirby said that there was he couldn't go into much more detail about, the actual specifics, just to defend kind of how they carry out operations for the future. But he said there was definitely collaboration with the SDF, so people who were on the ground, and they knew this was going to happen. But it was a full U.S. operation. When you look at the men who were there, the special forces were all U.S. citizens, U.S. personnel. So the SDF, from what it seems, did help, but it was more of a logistics side of it, which maybe brings us into, we could discuss as why it was in Idlib. I mean,
Yeah, that
Baghdadi
was
was
my last question
it's
that I had, and
yeah,
I this
yeah.
is the one that seems to have stumped the foreign policy establishment. So
It's an interesting one. Yeah, I mean, look, the HTS is not the most powerful organization, and it's the territory it holds, even if it doesn't really hold it completely. Like, there's swamps in it, where there is the Islamic State, Turkey, etc. So they're not like, they don't control that area, as you might imagine, like the SDF do in northeast, or the regime does, Assad does. So there is a possibility that, it was just a failure of kind of intercepting the guy, just because they don't have the capabilities of monitoring everything that's going on everywhere, and I'm sure the guy knew how to disguise himself pretty well. It's just one building in the middle of mostly nothing, and you'd have to recognize him as well. So it's interesting. I mean, HTS, it's run by Jolani, who used to be part of the Islamic State, or yeah, that was the big break with like the
yeah.
al-Nusra Front in Syria, between his alliance with the Islamic State or Al-Qaeda. But anyway, he eventually kind of broke from that and kind of created his own organization to oppose the regime, like strictly related to Syria and not the broader kind of Islamic State goals of creating a caliphate. And the US doesn't support them per se, but they sympathize. I would put it that way, maybe, just because they have common goals. They don't kind of fire on each other. They have common goals of, um, well, HTS wants to kind of wants to take down the Assad regime, essentially. And in doing so, they, fighting against, eliminating the Islamic State is also part of that, bringing stability to the country, to the region. Um, so yeah,
So
it's
all
an
right.
interesting one.
So kind of like
Yeah,
two questions here, and maybe this is too much speculation. You really can't say, but I
yeah.
guess I felt all right. One observation. I found it interesting that nobody was speculating that this raid was against Al Jolani. Like the U.S. wouldn't even bother to do that for some reason. Also seems to kind of go against maybe the narrative that he's been trying to put forward. Putting himself in a suit and going in Western press and talking about holding elections. If you got the head of ISIS living in your territory, but as you say, they may just not be able to control that well. This guy is probably good at disguising himself, etc. However, if so Jolani kind of the split between ISIS and Al Qaeda and everything like that. Jolani stayed on the Al Qaeda side. Is it possible that maybe ISIS is kind of folding back into Al Qaeda or something more along those lines? And that's why like he was allowed to stay there because they really don't have an issue with ISIS anymore.
Um, Al-Jolani, I don't think the US particularly likes Al-Jolani. He used to be an Islamist himself, but they're not even going. I'm sure if they wanted to kill him, they would have killed him, right? Yeah, at this point. But it's not in their objective just because they have common goals. As you said, he's been on PBS with that interview last year. Um, I think. Yeah, I don't know what would you say, like, more specifically, if the
Oh,
Islamic State.
yeah, like possibly if, HTS, Al Nusra, Al Jolani, his group, that umbrella group that controls Idlib, Syria, are maybe back allied with, more, not explicitly out in the open, but just having like ISIS like it kind of folded back into the Al
Right.
Qaeda structure, or if they're just like, yeah, we don't care. Like ISIS isn't really a problem for us anymore, and they're a bigger problem for America and Assad, and so they're just
Well,
allowing ISIS to do whatever they want to do at this point.
I see what you mean. Yeah, hard to tell, really hard to tell. I wouldn't rule it out. I wouldn't say it's also that likely, given their stated objectives anyway. I mean, Jolani's seems to I think he sees himself as alternative. Like he's from the region, and he definitely is trying to build up support for himself and for his group as this alternative that isn't the Assad regime. And so it isn't, part of, that kind of all the people who don't want him in power, which is why the revolution started in 2011. He's not, kind of detached himself from being an Islamist. And so, and then obviously he's not really allied with the United States per se. And therefore he's created this alternative political position for himself, which I think he's cultivating. And we'll see how much the organization grows going forward. But I saw he was running even the other day, something about distributing food to people in the region. And so he's gone for a big rebrand, and he's trying to cultivate less of that an Islamist figure and more of like a politician really that manages this territory. And hopefully I think in the long time he's trying to gain just legitimacy and hopefully take down Assad. But
Yeah,
it's
well,
it's a
the
lot.
interesting thing is he seems to be trying to adopt Assad's persona a little bit, right? Like this guy who could talk to the Western press. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that Assad was on stage with Nancy Pelosi in a not too, long skirt. Like, Assad didn't care. He wears a suit. And so I guess it's just interesting to me that Jelani is attempting to like look a little bit more like Assad to court the Americans into supporting him because the Americans hate Assad so much. I guess it just
Yeah.
goes to show how little the U.S. knows about all of this. And I gotta say, I'm really worried about Jelani capturing the hearts of the American foreign policy establishment and presenting himself as a real opposition to Assad and a way to morph this war and make sure that it continues to go on. But anything else
Yeah.
on the raid itself? Anything else on ISIS that we should hit on before we wrap up here?
Yeah. Yeah, just to finish off on that point, yeah, I'm not saying I'd I like many politicians, there's like the campaign side of it, and then once you get into power, see what happens, And I wouldn't put it past him that he wouldn't be the best leader of for Syria or any other part of the country, for that matter.
Right. Yeah.
But we'll see. Um, yeah, anything else to add? I would say there was actually one last thing maybe regarding the actual footage, which we don't know much about. There was so during the night, the pictures, it didn't seem like there was, much of like explosion and stuff like that when it comes to outside of obviously the detonation by al-Qurayshi himself. But in the morning, I saw a video, and this was it was in Arab, so I couldn't obviously know it was like a reporter filming the outside of the building, and it was actually a lit fire, which wasn't there in the middle of the night, and it was there in the morning. Just to put it out there for anybody who's interested and who sees that and might want to dig into it, because at the moment that's really strange, and we also don't know what that was about either. Um, and that's, I think, pretty much everything on the raid. If we about the Islamic State going forward, as I said earlier, it's changed a lot. I still haven't looked into it much, but I would like to learn more about how it's branched out in Africa, because that seems to be where it's transitioning more at the moment, just because there's more fertile grounds for it to kind of thrive there, especially at the moment in Nigeria, but many other regions of the continent as well. Um, And I would say Afghanistan. That's another interesting one to monitor because the Taliban, economically speaking, and just as control of the country, are not in the most stable position, and the Islamic State thrives on instability and taking kind of opportunity in that. So I would say those are the two most interesting kind of areas to look going forward. But yeah, for the rest in the Middle East, it's a lot more decentralized, and they'll regroup, kind of put another leader after Qurayshi. But for the time being, it seems to be fairly under control there.
All right, Matteo, thanks so much for coming back on the show. Tell people where they could follow you or what you're up to these days.
Yeah, I would say the main place you can find me at the moment is on Twitter. Just recently changed my at is I'll just spell it out. It's at Matixix. And there I kind of post stuff about foreign policy, all this sort of stuff. When I study more about the Islamic State, and mainly just geopolitics in general, some technology stuff and war. But yeah, that's definitely the place to find me.
All right, thanks, Matteo.
Thank you.